Okay, hello everyone. I'm Professor Lopez-Jantzen, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Taino today, and then Professor Nichols is going to talk about US history and perseverance. Okay, so here we just have a nice map showing where we're talking about. On his second voyage, Christopher Columbus reached Puerto Rico in 1493. And as you can see, here's our map of the Caribbean. And Puerto Rico right over here. Unlike on his first mission, on his second mission, Columbus had 17 ships and 12,000 men. It's a much larger mission. And originally, the Spanish had formed a colony over here in what had been called Hispaniola, and they kind of just sailed quickly over to Puerto Rico. And so going into this area of the Caribbean, you have sailors, you have noblemen from Spain, you have priests, you have farmers, you have artisans. The Spanish are coming over to Hispaniola, modern-day DR and Haiti, pretty much en masse. So the people that are encountered in this area are the Taino, which were one of the many groups that spoke an Arawak language, who had gradually spread from Venezuela up into this whole area in the Caribbean right over here, beginning around 400 BCE. And this is just a similar map of the Caribbean. And you can see that all over here, Puerto Rico, DR, Haiti, coming up, all in this area of the Caribbean, the Taino are the big group of people who had, for several hundred years, inhabited the area. And interacting with peoples that had already been there in the Caribbean, they developed communities on the island of Hispaniola, modern-day DR and Haiti, and Jamaica, Eastern Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and the Bahamas. So in 1493, when Columbus arrived in Puerto Rico, the Taino actually withdrew, and Columbus didn't find anyone. So he left the area alone, and they instead, the Spanish really focused on Hispaniola, okay, just a little bit of ways. So the Taino, they cultivated yucca, maize, sweet potatoes, beans, other crops. And in the years before this Spanish contact, their culture really flourished. To just talk a little bit about Taino Society, we have tribal leaders called cacique. You also have a lower level of society, but still noble people, the Bujiti, who are priests, doctors, and teachers in villages, and other noblemen making up a second social class, and the Naborias, who are a larger working class in society. So you have social stratification in Taino society, and you also have, in terms of numbers, on Hispaniola alone, where Columbus first made contact, they may have had up to 3 million Taino. You have densely settled towns and well-organized society. In Puerto Rico, they're divided into different tribes. And each tribe, like I said, is led by its own cacique. You also have one hereditary cacique that's ruling over all of the tribes in the island. So to the Taino, Puerto Rico was called Puerto Rican, which was the land of the brave lord. And that's actually where we get the word Boricua. And Columbus actually initially named it not Puerto Rico, but San Juan Bautista, after St. John the Baptist. So you have this Catholic influence. And in terms of the Spanish in Puerto Rico, the big thing that Columbus is looking for is gold. The Spanish really, really wanted gold, and the Taino did use gold for jewelry. They did have some gold in Puerto Rico. For the Spanish, gold was really, really important. For the Taino, they're really just using it for decoration. And the Taino did essentially help Ponce de Leon, who comes back to Puerto Rico, the larger exploratory force, in 1508. They initially helped him actually look for gold. Ponce de Leon himself, and here's an image of him over here on this PowerPoint, was the governor of one of the provinces of Hispaniola, and he had essentially been Columbus's lieutenant. He heard rumors about gold in Puerto Rico, and so in 1508 he was allowed to go to the island. The viceroy, which is literally the vice king of Hispaniola, gave him permission to go and explore Puerto Rico. So off he goes in 1508, looking, of course, for gold. In 1508, he founded the first Spanish settlement in Puerto Rico at Capara, which is near present-day San Juan, the capital. And the Taino cacique Aguabana was friendly, and he actually greeted Ponce de Leon. But soon after, you actually start to get conflicts between the Taino and the Spanish. Initially, you don't really have a problem. By 1509, the Spanish had actually subjugated most of the Taino and had most of the island under his control. For this, he was actually named governor and captain general of Puerto Rico. So putting people under his control definitely made the Spanish really like Ponce de Leon, and they rewarded him for it. He also moved the home base to a coastal settlement called Puerto Rico. It's actually at some point in the 1520s that the island takes that as its sort of general name. So Spain established the encomienda system, which was essentially where legal grants were given to Spanish people for land and for the peoples that were actually already living on it. And so what this did is it let the Spanish it allowed them to demand payment of tribute from the indigenous population. And it essentially turned the Taino into a class of forced laborers. The Taino primarily worked in gold mines, and due to the brutal work conditions and disease brought over from Europe, particularly but not limited to smallpox, over 90% of the Taino died. But the Taino didn't go out without a fight. And this is where we're talking about perseverance. In 1511, the Taino revolted against the Spanish. And so in 1511, you have several caciques who revolt. And they allied with another group of people, the Caribs, in order to try and get rid of the Spanish entirely. Unfortunately for them, it didn't actually work. And they were suppressed by Ponce de Leon, who he said was the governor of Puerto Rico, soon after. Hatui, a Taino chieftain who had fled from Hispaniola to Cuba with 400 indigenous peoples in order to try and unite the Cuban natives to get rid of the Spanish, was actually burned at the stake in February of 1512. So you have a series of revolts, not just in Puerto Rico, but around the Caribbean, of Taino who are really not happy with Spanish rule. Just our sort of final one here, in the 1520s, a Taino chieftain, Enriquillo, mobilized over 3,000 Taino in a successful rebellion in the 1520s. So this last rebellion, Hispaniola, not Puerto Rico, was actually successful. And these Taino were accorded land and a charter from the royal administration, the administration from Spain. So what actually happened because of that is that even though there's a small Spanish military presence in the region, they did often use diplomatic divisions because not all of the Taino were unified as one people, and also help from powerful native allies in order to control most of the region. So in this case, with Enriquillo, you have, in exchange for a seasonal salary, religious and language education, the Taino are working for the Spanish and Indian landowners. So this is essentially, so you do have Taino Rebellion, you do have the idea that they're not necessarily just going to allow the Spanish to take over land, although you have divisions between different groups. But ultimately what happens is, especially because of disease, partially because the Spanish are really working them on the encomienda system and in mines, you do really get a large dying out of the Taino, of the indigenous population in Puerto Rico. But a lot of this is due to disease, because in the Americas, didn't have any of these diseases, especially smallpox, but also influenza and a bunch of other things. So you get, in the Caribbean especially, over 90% of the population dies. But we do have a persistence of Taino heritage. So groups of people, and we have this information partially from US Census information, but many people currently identify as Taino, most notably amongst Puerto Ricans and also Dominicans, both on the islands and also here in the United States. And so some scholars, such as an ethnohistorian, Dr. Badillo at the University of Puerto Rico, state that even though the official Spanish records speak of a disappearance of the Tainos, you do have survivors and descendants that then do have children with both people of Spanish descent and also people of African descent. So we have a high percentage of mixed or triracial ancestry amongst Puerto Ricans, and you see some of that in Rosie's book. So you do have people claiming, even today, Taino ancestry, while also having Spanish and African ancestry. And just a quick note is that because you have so few Taino to first mine in Puerto Rico, and then also to sustain Puerto Rican agriculture, which increasingly comes to be based on sugarcane, the Spanish did import Africans as their sort of major labor source. So you have this mix amongst Puerto Rican peoples of people from African descent, Spanish descent, and also our indigenous Taino descent. And so in terms of what else we have for Taino heritage, in addition to people of Taino ancestry, is we have Puerto Rican words, words that are recognizable not just to Puerto Ricans, but in America in general. Animals like the iguana, food like yuca. Hamaca is actually the word for hammock, comes from the Taino hamaca. And also maracas in general. And I just found this image of Puerto Rican maracas over here. And I do just kind of finally want to draw your attention to a very good resource we have, the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian, downtown in Manhattan, which actually does have a section on the Taino and on other Caribbean indigenous populations and indigenous populations from the Americas in general, that if you guys are interested in, the admission is free and it's definitely worth a visit. Okay, and so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague James Nichols.
Do we know how to do it?
Yeah, do you have a marker? No.
I do have a marker. Wow, look at that. All right, hi everybody. So I'm going to follow up on what Dr. Lopez-Jantzen was talking about. She established that there's 3 different races which came to dominate the Puerto Rican phenotype and culture: African, Taino, and Spanish, right? So you ended somewhere in the 1500s, right? We're going to skip about 300 years, all right? And we're going to move into the 1800s, and we're going to talk about the beginnings of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, okay? Because clearly this book written by Rosie Perez is so much about the sort of transnational, although transnational is not quite right, because Puerto Rico is part of the United States, isn't it? Yeah, so I mean, transnational is not quite the right word, is it? So anyways, how about migratory patterns between Puerto Rico and the United States and how those get established, right? So let's go back to 1800. All right, most Latin American countries gained their independence in the 1820s, but Puerto Rico does not. Neither does Cuba, neither does Brazil, for reasons which have a lot to do with slavery, but they're complicated. Now, in the 1820s, Puerto Rico starts to have some sort of trade relationship with the United States. Why? Puerto Rico was a colony of which country? Spain, right? So Spain opens up the relationship with the Royal Cédula de Gratis, allowing its colonies to trade with countries that are friendly to Spain. That includes the United States. So in the 1820s, we have the beginning of commodities, tobacco, sugar, flowing out of Puerto Rico and into the United States, okay? We have the beginning of a trade relationship, and whenever you establish the flow of commodities between one place and another, people soon follow. So we have the first Puerto Ricans arriving in the United States in the 1820s onward, right? The people that come, a lot of them are workers, right? The people who are bringing their expertise gained in Puerto Rico as typesetters, interestingly enough, as cigar rollers. So they produce tobacco too. And they move into the United States. It's a small group, and a lot of them establish themselves in New York, right? The people who establish themselves in New York actually can be a little bit radical. These are radical Puerto Ricans, kind of like Cubans. These people want their independence from Spain, but you can't really talk about it in Puerto Rico because you'll be repressed by the Spanish. But come to New York, you can say whatever you want. And kind of like Jose Marti comes from Cuba and establishes a political organization which advocates for the independence of Cuba, in New York, so too do Puerto Ricans start to arrive in the late 1800s and start advocating for the independence of their island from Spanish domination. Fast forward to 1898 and the Spanish-American War. Now, the Spanish-American War is when the United States gets itself an empire. And the empire that it gets for itself is what's left of the Spanish Empire. All right? So that includes Philippines, Guam, arguably Cuba, but also Puerto Rico. All right? Now, does Puerto Rico ever gain its independence? No, it's annexed by the United States, right? And, 1898, Puerto Rico is formally annexed by the United States. Now, do they immediately become citizens of the United States? They do not. That doesn't happen until 1917. In a lot of ways, the Puerto Ricans have traded one colonizer for another. Rather than the Spanish being their colonial overlords, now it's the United States. All right? And and Puerto Rico has kind of a junior relationship to the United States. The governors of Puerto Rico into the 20th century are appointed by the United States, right? But there's something else which begins to happen, and that's the beginning of migration of Puerto Ricans into the United States. And, well, why do you think they came, right? Why do you think Puerto Ricans went into the United States? Freedom, okay. Freedom from what? Okay, freedom from oppression, but yeah.
I was going to say, like, work.
Yeah, so often it's economic opportunity, isn't it? I mean, that's the same story as today with immigration. What was no different in the late 19th century. It was people looking for work and just, they're citizens of the United States now, right? So they don't have any difficulty getting into the United States. So these same cigar rollers, typesetters are coming into the United States as well. And guess what? They're pretty radical. Right? A lot of them think that, the working man should be treated better than he is. A lot of them think that maybe Puerto Rico should have its independence. And they make a very interesting community. You know what they're called in the history of Puerto Rico-U.S. relations? Pioneros, right? Pioneers. Because they're pioneering the relationships between the United States and Puerto Rico. And rather than arriving on on airplanes, like today, they arrived on steamboats, steamships. Right? Okay, so anyways, this takes us into the early 1900s. Most of these early immigrants were working class folks. They moved to New York, but they also moved to Philadelphia. They moved to Tampa Bay. They moved to Chicago. Places where they produce tobacco. Places where they have cigar rolling facilities. And that's why so many of them, are moving there. They're looking for jobs doing that. There's not a whole lot of them. 1910, there's about 1,000 Puerto Ricans in the United States. But 10 years later, they live in all 45 states, right? So we have a growing Puerto Rican community in the United States. And I say community, right? I don't throw that word around lightly. There's a Spanish-speaking colonia. People who live together in one place, and they do build a community which helps them persevere, right? So what kind of things help hold that community together? Bodegas. You guys know what bodegas are, right? Yeah, sure. Well, they were building bodegas pretty early on, and those served as sort of centers in their communities. Boarding houses. Right? All these people coming into the community, they got to have some kind of place to stay, right? So Puerto Ricans would open up boarding houses where they could go. Restaurants. You want to get the food from your homeland, don't you? So restaurants emerge as well. So do theaters and Spanish language newspapers. All right? So talk about the persistence of culture. Here you have Spanish language newspapers which deal specifically with issues that Puerto Ricans might be concerned with, right? On top of that, you also have hometown social clubs, right? So the Hijos de Patillas. That's where the people who originally came from the town of Patillas in Puerto Rico, they could meet with one another, talk about what was going on at home, make networks, establish themselves in the neighborhood, make friends, make connections. Right? So you see they're building this community here. And you know who was really important in that community? Businessmen, right? Puerto Rican businessmen, because they were elite. They knew how to get around. They knew how to find jobs for people. They usually knew English, and they could serve as liaisons, right? Intermediaries, people who could move between the white community and between the Puerto Rican community. So they took on a really important role for themselves as sort of cultural brokers for the new Puerto Ricans who arrived. You know who else was important? Women. right? Women were important because they helped establish those boarding houses, which were so important to helping the Puerto Ricans who first arrived in New York find a place to live and to stay. You know what else they did? They took care of the kids, right? Like other working women. You know, they needed a place to leave their kid during the day, so a lot of women would make it their job to take care of their kids. Now, officially, only 25% of Puerto Rican women had jobs, but you know they all worked. It's just they were taking care of the kids, and they were doing work that is traditionally unpaid. They were probably paid for it, but it was, not reported, right? So, you have a lot of women who are working. You got these business leaders pulling it together. And what ends up happening, right, is these communities grow. By the time we get to World War I, there's 70,000 Puerto Ricans living in the United States. And you know how you can tell that community is growing? Well, they start to expand, right? So East Harlem, right? It's a Puerto Rican community from way back. They started to expand their borders. And how do you know the Puerto Ricans are expanding? Because they got bodegas coming up in new places. So they build a bodega in the Jewish part of town, right? And they're starting to fight with the Puerto Ricans and the Jewish and the Italians and the blacks. And clearly the Puerto Ricans are expanding into this territory. A riot erupts in 1926 because mostly the Jewish and Italian people who had been in Harlem before them resented their presence there. Fast forward another 10 years, 1936, we have the Harlem riot. And traditionally we think of this as African Americans who are, tired of being singled out and brutalized by white policemen, who are tired of the fact that New York City during the Great Depression is not helping anyone in Harlem at all. Well, Puerto Ricans rioted right alongside those African Americans. Okay, so this takes us up to World War II, and that's where our story really begins to change, because during World War II, all those men were off fighting in Europe and Japan. That opened up a lot of jobs, right? And besides opening up a lot of jobs, the government needs all kinds of manufacturers to fight that war. So they need people to work. And you know what? They start contracting Puerto Ricans to come from the island of Puerto Rico to the United States to take up those jobs. Now, this is nothing new, right? Like you said, economic opportunity is one of the main reasons that immigrants leave one country and go to another. Again, it's not a country. I keep making that mistake. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. But they leave Puerto Rico and come to the United States to take up opportunities working as contract laborers, right? Working in agriculture, working in factories. And what happens, right, is that you have a lot of people coming in. This gets really expanded in the late 1940s when the United States government, working in conjunction with the local Puerto Rican governors, undertakes something called Operación Manos a la Obra. Right? What's Manos a la Obra mean? Hands to work. Right? Operation Bootstrap was called in America at the time. What Operation Bootstrap is, it's the industrialization of Puerto Rico. All right? So we know what industrialization means, right? It's when they start building factories. It's also about the transition of a society from being a primarily agricultural society to one that is primarily manufacturing. All right? So the United States encourages American factories to go down to Puerto Rico and to set up. They get tax breaks. They don't have to pay They don't have to pay Puerto Ricans a minimum wage. All right? So you can see that this is a pretty sweet plum for Americans to go down to Puerto Rico and to set up businesses. And they do. So the manufacturing capacity of Puerto Rico expands tenfold, 20-fold, right? But what happens is in the countryside, you also have the mechanization of agriculture. All these rural folks, Puerto Rico had been almost entirely an agricultural society, slowly transitions to an industrial society. All those folks in the fields are out of work. They go into the cities and they look for jobs, but there's not enough jobs to absorb them. So if they can't find a job in San Juan, what do you think they do? Go to New York, right? That's the answer, right? Economic opportunity. That's what we're looking at here. So what happens is Operation Bootstrap, the industrialization of Puerto Rico, spurs a great migration of Puerto Ricans from the island to New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and a lot of them show up, right? Now, Puerto Rico has an unemployment rate of 13% in the 1960s, which is pretty high. But you know what? Most historians and sociologists believe it would have been much higher had there not been the United States to absorb so many of those unemployed people. So this is kind of at the basis of this complicated relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. I mean, Puerto Rico has kind of a junior status with the United States, but so many Puerto Ricans view the United States as a land of opportunity. So it gets complicated, right? It also gets complicated because starting in the late 1940s, well, white folks can't help but notice there's a lot of Puerto Ricans showing up. And, you know, guess what happens, right? You have all kinds of sort of stereotypes emerge. Life magazine does a spread, you know, it says it's the first airborne diaspora into the United States. And they also offer some figures, you know. By 1980, 2.1 million Puerto Ricans live in the United States, but the vast majority of them come during the 1950s and 1960s. As they come, there's overcrowding, right? There's poverty, and you know, as so often happens, people blame the community itself for the problem, right? Well, Puerto Ricans fight back. They are part and parcel of the civil rights movement, which takes off in the 1960s, but actually Puerto Ricans are ahead of the curve. In the 1950s, they've already got activists. A really important one, a guy who died just last year at the age of 98. Right? I'd trade for that. Gilberto Genera Valentin. He organizes the Congreso de Pueblos, which is an umbrella organization which brings together all these different Puerto Rican clubs which organize for the political rights of Puerto Ricans. And you know what else he establishes? Oh, you guys run into the traffic every year from it. There we go, the Puerto Rican Day Parade, 1956, very much a celebration of Puerto Rican heritage, right? This continues, 1964, the March for a Better Education. A lot of the concerns that the Puerto Ricans have in the 1960s with the civil rights movement are similar to the ones of African Americans, but there are some differences too. So the 1965 Voting Rights Act, right? This is the act that finally puts teeth into the 15th Amendment of the Bill of Rights, which allows all people, men back then, but you know, people regardless of color, to have the right to vote. Finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 helps establish safeguards so that blacks in the American South can vote. But you know, it was important for Puerto Ricans too, because in New York State there was a literacy test. If you wanted to vote, you had to take a literacy test. And you know, plenty of Puerto Ricans were literate, but not necessarily in English, right? So the ballot would be printed in English, and they didn't know who they were voting for. So today, when you go into the ballot box and you see that so many different languages are there and help you vote, you can thank the 1965 Voting Rights Act for that, and particularly you can thank Puerto Ricans for that, because they helped to establish the precedent of putting different languages on the ballot. Anyways, as we go forward in the 1960s, the civil rights movement becomes more militant. Some Puerto Ricans start demanding better access to education, and you know what? They get it. 1968 is the establishment of Hostos Community College. Do you guys know where Hostos is? Yeah, South Bronx, right? In a Puerto Rican neighborhood. It's a bilingual institution meant to serve a Latino community and help give Puerto Ricans in the South Bronx and for the rest of the city a leg up, okay? You also have radical groups, so the student union at the Hostos Community College and other colleges that Puerto Ricans are attending, they start meeting together, talking politics, and they morph into a group called the Young Lords. You guys ever heard of the Young Lords? Yeah, it's kind of like the Black Panthers for Puerto Ricans, right? You know, they would serve, they would take up places where they thought that the government wasn't providing for the Puerto Rican community, so they would offer hot lunches, hot breakfast to kids, stuff like this. You guys know Geraldo Rivera? Yeah. He was a young lord. Hard to imagine now, but in fact he was, right? So going forward, right, another part of the 1960s civil rights movement is the sort of celebration of identity and heritage, right? Black is beautiful, you know? Puerto Ricans have that too. Especially as expressed with the establishment of Puerto Rican studies programs all over CUNY, Lehman, Brooklyn, Queens College, right? These all either have or have had, I don't know what's going on with budgets these days, but Puerto Rican studies programs. All right, so anyways, this is the movement, right? And the movement helped end legal discrimination, helped get Puerto Ricans equal access to at least some of the promises of American life, yet, and then we see this in Rosa Parris's book, right? Puerto Ricans still seem to be at something of a disadvantage. Why is that? Why is it that, you know, these disadvantages between racial groups continue to persist. There's no culture of poverty. That's not the reason. But there are some reasons, right? Now, Puerto Ricans have seen their household incomes grow since the 1980s, but not at the same rate as other groups. Why is that? Well, there's a few reasons. What did you want to say? All right. Why is that, right? One reason, they're a young population, right? The people who migrate into the United States, did it again, who migrate into New York from Puerto Rico, they're young, right? They have kids. It skews the median age downward. Do you make more money when you're young or when you're old? Yeah, when you're old, right? So, I mean, that's one of the reasons that their income has not been able to keep up, because they are a very young population of people. Another reason is something called post-industrialization. If you take a history class dealing with the 20th century, you'll deal with this. The factory jobs leave the United States in large numbers in the 1970s, whereas working in a factory could have offered a good job for a lot of people up until the 1970s. Those opportunities disappear, right? So what we have instead are very high-paying service sector jobs and very low-paying service sector jobs. And I bet you can guess how that pans out in terms of race and gender. And finally, still, limited English proficiency, right? So that's another reason. But nevertheless, right, migration continues. It persists, despite the fact that there are obstacles still to overcome. In the 1990s, as much as 8% of Puerto Rico's population moved to the mainland United States. Now, there have been some changes. 17% of them now live in Florida. That's especially professionals. They like to go to Florida more than to New York for some reason. Between 2000 and 2006, there seemed to be a drop. You know what was happening? Some of those New Yorkers, right? The Puerto Ricans who moved to New York and were successful, they started moving back, right? So, I mean, you actually have this way, that's one of the ways that, we have the connection between New York and Puerto Rico is so essential, right? So many Puerto Ricans don't necessarily resent the United States because it has brought opportunity. I mean, it's complicated, right? But it has brought opportunity. I mean, those people who are successful and they go back, but even more than that, remittances, right? You guys know what remittances are? They're money. It's money earned by immigrants, or in this case, migrants, sent back home. And people estimate that anywhere from $500 million up to $1 billion annually is sent back from the mainland United States to Puerto Rico. That helps out the economy there, doesn't it? So it's complicated, right? It's complicated, the relationship between the two. Any case, clearly Puerto Rico, in conclusion, Puerto Rico obviously has these very important ties to the United States, and more people have migrated from Puerto Rico to the United States than from any other Caribbean nation. You know who's second after Puerto Rico? You guys want to guess?
Yeah.
Who?
Yeah.
Dominican Republic. It's a good guess, but it's not right.
Cuba?
Nope.
Jamaica?
Who said Jamaica? Good job. Yeah, it's Jamaica. Now more than half. There's less than half as many come from Jamaica as from Puerto Rico, but still, just goes to illustrate just how many people are coming from Puerto Rico to the United States. So we got two major recent milestones that we'll just end with to sort of tie together the main themes here. One of migration, right? In 2008, there were more Puerto Ricans living in the United States, in the United States mainland, than living in Puerto Rico, all right? And the other is, and this ties in with our question about civil rights. 2009, Barack Obama appoints Sonia Sotomayor, a Puerto Rican from the South Bronx, who grew up in a housing project. She didn't have her dad. She just had a working mother. Her mom worked hard, sent her to school. She got an Ivy League education, and she became the first Latina to serve on the Supreme Court. So perseverance. Let's look at Sonia Sotomayor for that. So I guess I'll leave you with a couple questions, right? The first, and this is to tie back to Rosie Perez. Does Rosie Perez have a connection to Puerto Rico still, right? Yeah, she clearly does, right? But maybe we can talk about how that was. And secondly, right, do you think that Rosie Perez has more, less, or about the same level of opportunities that her ancestors did? Remember, was it her grandma who immigrated first from Puerto Rico? Her parents, right. So, these are questions to think about. right? Okay, well, that's it for me.